I am delighted to be joined by Stephen Donziger, human rights and environmental activist, was an attorney before he was wrongfully disbarred. Stephen, there's people that are watching that are new and don't know your story. It's a long story, but the Cliff Notes version is you were basically a political prisoner for 3 years, both house arrest and then actual prison because you had the temerity to go after Chevron legally for them poisoning the Amazon in Ecuador. And Chevron, instead of paying to remediate that, went on a political corporate crusade against you.
Yeah, and basically, I represent indigenous and farmer communities in the Amazon of Ecuador. Over many years, we litigated a massive pollution case, won roughly a $10 billion judgment against Chevron. Instead of paying, they came back. This is in Ecuador's court. It's affirmed by Ecuador Supreme Court, the case. Instead of paying, Chevron came back to U.S. courts and started to attack me. They sued me for $60 billion, most amount of money anyone's ever been sued for. And ultimately, we kept going, and they got a judge to hold me in criminal contempt of court. And the prosecutor would not prosecute the case. It was a baseless case. And the judge appointed a Chevron law firm to prosecute me in the name of the U.S. government, which is why I am the only person ever that we know of who's been prosecuted directly by a corporation, a private corporation, and detained in U.S. history. And ultimately, they tried to silence me. And, it's an example of corporate capture of government, corporate capture of our courts, which, as you know, is a huge issue now in our country. But that's what happened to me. But, we're keeping on going. And, the communities in Ecuador have this great judgment, and they intend to enforce it against Chevron's assets and force Chevron to comply with it and clean up their ancestral lands. So, that's why I say I'm probably, at the time, I was a corporate political prisoner in the United States, detained by a corporation, by Chevron.
And that's a great segue. I do want to get to the environmental issues in America, but as we speak at the DNC in Chicago, there is, I believe, theater and pageantry going on. And the Democratic Party is basically crowing about the threat to democracy posed by Donald Trump. I do think there's validity to that. However, the messenger, it's hard to listen to the messenger because Attorney General Merrick Garland did not step in, even though there were Congress people who directly asked him to step in on your behalf to stop this corporate prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of other, questionable things going on in our democracy, namely corporations essentially running roughshod over private citizens, working class people, corporations poisoning communities like Flint, East Palestine. And you're not going to hear about any of that at the DNC this week. You're going to hear about the threat that Trump poses, not to minimize Trump, but do you think our democratic system is thriving right now?
I don't. I mean, I think we have a very flawed liberal democracy that is, in a state of crisis right now, frankly. I mean, even for a liberal democracy. By liberal democracy, I mean there's elections every 4 years. There's no real worker participation in the making of economic policy. There's no real worker participation in making of really any policy at a meaningful level between elections. And elections are extremely limited because the choices are so limited. I mean, people might not know, or maybe your viewers or your listeners do know, but there's other viable candidates who are running or attempted to run for president. Among them, my friend Marianne Williamson, Jill Stein, Cornel West, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., no matter what you think of him, like he's run a campaign. They won't let any of these independent voices on the debate stage. The corporate media will not cover their policy positions for the most part. I mean, you'll hear a story about RFK leaving a dead bear in Central Park, but you won't hear about his critique of corporate capture of the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm not defending him, or I'm not endorsing any of these people. What I am pointing out is our democracy presents a really limited choice. Every 4 years, it kind of allows people to subjectively feel like they're participating. but it's really set up in advance such that, at least in terms of our economic policy, it's really hard to change anything. And, I would argue that our two-party system, it's not just the United States, you see this in the UK, the ability of the people to shape economic policy through voting, through the ballot box, has slowly been lost over the last several decades. I mean, we really turned over the making of economic policy from the people to institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the Federal Reserve, or elected leaders in this country who are for the most part beholden to corporate interests because they depend on them for their campaign contributions. So while I don't take lightly the fact we do get to vote, I mean, I think it's important. I think people should vote, and I think people should participate. At the same time, it's important to recognize that the choices are very limited. In other countries, most European countries, for example, there's multi-party democracies. Their national legislatures can have 4, 5, 6, 7 parties. It forces them to form coalition governments, and it allows all sorts of voices to create innovative policy proposals to address, the things that afflict modern societies. We don't have that in the United States. So while people can get all excited about what they're going to see at the convention in Chicago, I would caution people to keep some perspective. The fundamental problems of this country, the over incarceration, the extreme income inequality, poverty. I mean, there's 38 million people who live in poverty, and another tens of millions who live just above the poverty threshold, who are struggling to make ends meet. Generally, those issues are not going to be talked about in a meaningful way in Chicago. It really is presented as a sort of horse race, like a sports competition. And I fear Donald Trump. I mean, I don't want that man to be elected. I think he is a mortal threat to our liberal democracy. But I also think, in the effort to keep him out of office, we cannot forget that we need more than what the Democratic Party is currently offering. I think we need a multi-party democracy where there can be meaningful participation by all sorts of sectors in the making of policy, not just a vote every 4 years with a very limited choice.
I've been going around the country now for almost a decade, covering what I do not think it's too dramatic to say is environmental genocide. I mean, I just published a book on the Flint water cover up. It's 10 years now. 10 years. The water is still toxic and no one has been held criminally accountable. I was just in East Palestine, Ohio, right on the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania. I mean, in your case, it was Chevron. In this case, Norfolk Southern, a multi-billion-dollar railroad, unnecessarily detonated toxic chemicals over Ohio and Pennsylvania. Toxicologists I'm talking to say that plume spread to 8 states, including Canada. And I just interviewed a man with double breast cancer. I just interviewed a 35-year-old woman, lost her hair. I'm interviewing people who have dementia at 55. I interviewed 18-year-olds who are having seizures.
And it's just a good example. We're not making this up. I'm constantly worrying, like, there's something else wrong, or, it's just constantly, I'm sick, I barely eat. I have to force myself to eat. That's another thing, like, ever since this happened.
All were healthy before, from Flint to East Palestine, to other communities in America, water, air, soil. There is a real corporate, I would say, that the pattern is corporations, whether it's intentional or just, recklessness, are harming citizens. Yet one thing I agree with RFK on, there's corporate capture of our EPA, so many industries, and none of that is really talked about in either party. And now you have a Supreme Court that has just ruled that essentially agencies can't regulate. I mean, I think we're in dangerous territory beyond democracy with, if you're in the wrong community at the wrong time, you can be harmed and your health could be harmed. And there's very little recourse for that. Your thoughts?
Well, you make an excellent point. By the way, kudos to you for your great work as a journalist. It's interesting, though, isn't it? You're an independent journalist. You created your own news site. the major media outlets have now completely ignored the story that you just described in Ohio, the detonation by Norfolk Southern that has poisoned 8 states. They've almost completely ignored it now since about a few weeks after the actual incident. Like, you don't even hear about it other than people like yourself, okay? And, same thing with the Flint water crisis. I mean, your book outlines really one of the most egregious corporate and governmental scams in the modern history of the United States. No media coverage whatsoever. It's not going to be mentioned at the DNC. And the point of these two stories, which you've so, effectively covered, and which I followed your coverage very closely, is that there is massive corporate abuse of the average citizen in this country, whether it's Forever Chemicals by 3M, whether it's Norfolk Southern's train derailment. You're seeing this over and over again. And our EPA has been completely defanged. I mean, it's a very ineffective regulatory body. It doesn't even regulate most of the harmful, toxic, and carcinogenic chemicals that corporations are spewing into the environment. It doesn't even regulate them. And corporations pretty much have their way. And then when lawyers like myself file a plaintiff's lawsuit to try to, get compensation for the harm and provide at least some incentive for these corporations to refrain from engaging in future harm, we get attacked by this right-wing judicial system. In my case, I got actually detained for almost 3 years for winning a big case against Chevron for doing the same thing in Ecuador's Amazon. Many of the health problems you're describing, I've seen with my own eyes time and time again over many years in the Amazon jungle of Ecuador, where Chevron deliberately dumped billions of gallons of toxic waste. The issue of corporate capture of our government, the lack of regulation of corporations when they pollute, might be the single greatest threat to the well-being of our society. And there's a connection between that and the lack of democracy, isn't there? I mean, if we, the people, cannot have a meaningful voice beyond going to the ballot box for this very limited choice every 4 years, then it's going to be extremely difficult to rein in the power of these corporations. You mentioned the Supreme Court. I mean, people need to understand, and this again won't be talked about at the DNC. We have had a quiet judicial coup in this country over the last 3-4 years, and a whole series of cases where 6 ultra-conservative, deeply reactionary, unelected justices, 5 of whom were appointed by presidents who didn't even win the popular vote, by the way, are determining how the rest of us 330 million people in this country can live. Everything from reproductive freedom to whether our government will have the power to even regulate corporate behavior and to take the measures we need to save the planet from the climate crisis. And there's a whole host of issues. And I'll also say this, as it gets worse and worse, the corporate pollution, the corporate abuse of the average citizen, the threats to our liberal democracy, the repression is deepening. Police actions against protests in this country are really getting nasty. And you're seeing this with the pro-Palestinian protesters who are protesting, what legal experts believe is Israel's genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. You saw this at Columbia University in New York, up the street from where I live, where over 100 students were arrested. And all of this is going to reignite, by the way, and I think will be a major issue in the November election when students come back to campus in a couple of weeks and the protests start again. And, we've seen this summer in New York City, the summer of heat, protests outside Citibank. There's been almost 500 arrests. The New York City Police Department has become basically an open tool of the corporate class to go after protest. And these are peaceful protests. These are legal protests. It is legal to protest. It is legal to criticize a corporation. It is legal to speak out against the government of Israel and not be called an anti-Semite in this country. But we are seeing an increasing amount of state repression. I mean, look, I'm a victim of it myself. I see it with a lot of people getting sentenced to draconian terms in prison for engaging in acts of peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience. We have to connect the dots, and we have to sort of look at the whole picture to understand how we need to organize to change this.
And to end, I should also add, it was legal to prosecute on behalf of vulnerable indigenous people in Ecuador. I don't know of any human rights attorney that was under house arrest for 3 years and then imprisoned for a misdemeanor, which, by the way, the misdemeanor was essentially that you would not provide your communications with your clients, which is supposed to be legally protected by attorney-client privilege. So there's a lot of things that on the books are legal, but are being attacked. So I
Very
think you make.
true.
Go ahead.
And let me say this. I mean, the crazy part about me going into detention at the hands of Chevron, beyond the fact it's the first time a private corporation has been able to lock someone up directly, is 3 federal judges in our country have deemed in various written opinions that what happened to me was completely unconstitutional and illegal, as has the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which ordered the U.S. government to compensate me for the illegal deprivation of my liberty for 993 days. The point I want to make is President Biden, before he leaves office, needs to pardon me. And yeah, he needs to pardon me because this has caused me great pain, and it's caused me and my family great pain. It hinders my ability to do my human rights work. I cannot leave the country. They still have my passport. I owe Chevron, FYI, millions of dollars in court costs that the judge imposed on me as a way to basically bankrupt me so I can't do human rights work. President Biden needs to take a stand on this issue to tell the world that what happened to me, that is a private corporate prosecution of a human rights lawyer in the United States, is wrong, it's illegal, it's immoral, it's unethical, and it cannot happen again. So I have launched a pardon campaign to get a pardon, not just for me because I need it to do my work, but to really kind of put forth the basic principle that in any rule of law country, corporations cannot prosecute people directly. That's just flat out wrong. I've never seen it before actually anywhere in the world but here. And I'm calling on the president to deal with it. If he doesn't, I'm going to call on the future president to deal with it. It's a really important principle that needs to be stated because people forget. I mean, I'm not detained anymore, but I'm a prisoner of the United States of America. My clients are down in Ecuador. I cannot leave the country, and they have my passport, and they won't let me even have a bank account. So I just want to say, if anyone wants to help, we have a website called freedonziger.com where you can sign a petition. We also need funds to pay my legal fees and to sort of run this campaign. But it's an important way to help on the issues I'm talking about, which is the connection between corporate capture, corporate pollution, repression of activism, and the need to create a better society. So I apologize for taking our limited time in saying that, but I need help. We all need help to protect the right to free speech and the right to protest in this country.
And that's the website, freedonziger.com, which shows the call to action to pardon you. And obviously, if people could chip in, because they have bankrupted you, which was kind of the point. My last question, obviously, you know, this has awakened you, what happened to you, and now you're kind of like a full-time activist. What's your message to people watching? Because I'm sure you've seen the left in this country in a kind of post-Bernie era has been fractured and split. And, you know, there's people who say, to hell with working within the Democratic Party, only third party. There's people say, to hell with it all, forget electoral politics. Let's just focus on direct action. And there's people who say, to hell with just marching in the streets. We need economic boycotts. It's either going to be Trump or Harris, unfortunately. Neither is a good scenario, but for the left, you know, what do you think is the way forward in terms of challenging the corporate state, so to speak?
Well, I would say number one is sort of some personal advice. Never, ever fall into cynicism. It's important we deal with these issues to the best of our abilities at all times. Like, we have to fight. We have to rely on good old-fashioned grassroots organizing. We have to understand the labor movement is really important. The union movement is really important. And I think we need to think about a real political party, a labor-based political party in this country that can challenge the hegemony of the two-party system that is not dealing with our fundamental issues. All of the strategies you just outlined, whether it be protest, rejection of the two-party system, or voting even for Kamala Harris, all of those are viable options to help protect what's left of our fragile democracy and try to advance the ball. Okay. You know, people need to make their own choices. There's no one way to do this, except we do need to recognize what we're up against, the seriousness of the moment. I mean, we're in a historical moment now that I've never seen before. And I've been doing this work, you know, for essentially, you know, 40 years now. I'm in my early 60s. I've been an activist my whole life. And man, it's really hard to watch the thing take this kind of trajectory in recent years, to see our Supreme Court completely bought by corporate interests, to be not a court, but essentially a political body at this point, an activist political body, to advance an extreme right-wing agenda. So we have to deal with all these issues. We have to connect the dots, and we have to get information. You know, if you're only looking at, you know, the mainstream media outlets, New York Times, the cable news networks, et cetera, you know, you're going to fall into the trap likely of thinking that this election coming up is like a real deep, meaningful choice, and it's not. So I would urge people to be vigilant, to sort of be as smart as they can about this, not fall into cynicism, and to really follow people, frankly, like Jordan Sheraton, and other independent journalists who are reporting on these issues that the large media outlets are completely ignoring, as a way to really anesthetize the population so people don't deal with these issues. So it starts with our head and understanding the basic issues, how to connect the dots. And from there, you go to the best strategy that works for you.
Absolutely. And I encourage people check out freedonziger.com, because, I mean, it's hard to fight if you can't leave the country, you can't practice law, and you are basically being bankrupted. So thank you for taking the time, Stephen. Thanks for everything, and we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. Keep up the great work. Appreciate it.